Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of After Wednesday. I'm your host, Jeffrey Hayes. So excited to be back with you this week, and very excited about my guest this week. I have with us live tonight the writer, pop culture critic extraordinaire, Alan Kistler. How are you tonight, Alan?
I'm good. I'm good.
Well, fantastic, fantastic. I want to jump right into it because we have so much to get to, and I will go ahead and remind everybody that audience Q&A is enabled tonight. So if you're watching us through Google+, please feel free to type your questions in. They'll appear up on the screen, and I'll be happy to ask Alan. Also, if you're listening to us, but you're not on Google+, maybe you're over on YouTube, you can tweet questions to me or to Alan, who was kind enough to say that on his Twitter feed, so please do so. But I'll jump right in here. I wanted to ask you, first of all, you write on your website, I enjoy introducing people to good stories and characters. Fiction is meant to be shared, and it's silly to act elitist about it. What sort of defines good for you?
I mean, in that sense, I mean it in just the broadest sense. Is it enjoyable? Is it? Do you get something out of it? And that can be whatever it is. There are comics I enjoy that I think are incredible, intellectually driven. Things that really make you rethink your life, and there are stories I read in comics that are just about, we thought this was really weird and we're going to show it to you, and here's a dog in a cape who can fly, and because
right.
Why not? And that's also great. That's also something you get something out of. The main point of that statement was that I know there are some folks who act like gatekeepers with fandoms. And even when there have been enough, or there's also just an intimidation factor some people feel, especially if they're delving into something like a superhero or like Doctor Who, where they know that there's decades of history, and they're worried, oh my God, do I have to start at the beginning? So my main point was just, this is meant to be shared, and everyone comes into it in their own way, and everyone wants something different from it. Even Batman fans will have different feelings about what Batman they want and what atmosphere they want for Batman, and that's fine.
And I think it tied in nicely. And I pulled up the website for everybody to see, and I was reading directly there from the third paragraph. But in your foreword to your Doctor Who book, you said to my grandparents, Alan and Marie, who always encouraged me to look behind the scenes of stories I enjoyed. And Alan, I want to say my fiance cried at that statement. She thought it was really beautiful. I think it's
goodness. I didn't mean to pull on the heartstrings so quickly at the beginning.
But it's a really wonderful sentiment, and I wanted to ask you sort of what were the first stories that you looked behind, and how was that encouraged?
Well, my grandparents were great supporters of the arts, and so in some cases behind the scenes meant literally. They would take me to plays at Olney Theater and sometimes at the Kennedy Center, because I grew up in the D.C. area, and they, being who they were, often knew members of the cast or the production, sometimes the directors and such. And in all of those cases, whenever they had the chance to, we would watch a play together, and then they would literally take me behind the scenes and would introduce me to some people, and I would get to ask these actors about, why did you do it this way, and was that hard to do, and all that jazz. And when I first started getting into certain sci-fi stories, my grandfather would ask me, whatever I was said I liked, he would ask me, so why do you like it? And he would just get me to start thinking, what made this science fiction book more interesting to me than the other? What made this? Sorry about that. What made this protagonist more interesting, and what made me connect to them more? so I just started thinking about that, and then when I got into comics, I would tell him about certain stories, and we were looking at, how Batman might be drawn differently between these two, or might be written differently between these two.
Mm-hmm.
And he would ask about, well, look at the date of that story, and look at who wrote it, and did he write other Batman stories you like or dislike, and all that. So it was all about looking at whatever you like. Just take a few moments to examine it and check out why you think you like it. And even when I was drawing, I used to draw all the time. And if I remember clearly, I was talking about this recently actually. Drawing Bucky, Captain America and Bucky.
Yeah.
One time when I was probably 9 or 10, and I happened to have drawn Bucky with longer hair than he was normally depicted with, at least at that time in the comics.
Uh-huh.
And it was sort of longer, wilder hair. And my grandfather asked, "So why did you do that?"
Mm-hmm.
And would make me think and have to reason my argument. Did I just do it because, or did I have a reason? I would think, and I told him, like, well, Bucky is kind of a daredevil, and he's kind of like, he's younger and he's wilder, and he does things that Cap doesn't do, and I don't know, I'm not writing a story about that, so I just put it in the hair, and he's like, okay, good, you thought about it, cool. So that's really what that meant, and just they taught me very early on, look at the context, look at what's going on, and what it is that's really driving you about some stories. Don't just say, well, I like that character and I don't like that one. What's hitting you about this one that didn't hit you about the other one?
Yeah, and you also say here on your website, you say you regularly speak not only on panels but sometimes in classrooms about superhero stories as morality plays and feminism and pop culture and minority and LGBTQ representation in media. Your writing, and what I'm hearing here as we're chatting, is that you seem to be very concerned with people not asking the question why enough, of why things are a certain way, or how have they become a certain way. How do you approach that, say, when you're speaking to a classroom full of students?
Well, I spoke to one class, for instance, about Batman. They were at my old high school, Georgetown Prep, in Maryland. There is, for seniors, a hero literature class taught by Mr. Cheeseman, who taught me that class and also taught me a year of English, and he's awesome. And he, after I attended, and after many conversations we had when I was a student, he started involving Batman in the curriculum. As part of his talks about the hero's journey, and also about the dichotomy that Batman is both a romantic and an ironic hero. He's romantic because he's the greatest detective, and his biology allowed him to become this superior human being, and he didn't just train to be a detective, thank God. He also happened to have the IQ necessary to juggle all these skills and languages and such.
Right.
But he's also ironic because he'll never really be done. He'll never have done enough. Even in stories where he sort of has a happily ever after and retires the Batman costume,
right.
Even in those stories, he finds some other way to fight crime, whether it be that he becomes mayor of Gotham, or that he becomes the new police commissioner, or that he trains a younger Batman, or that he trains a brotherhood of Batman. Or a whole organization of Batmen and Batwomen. Even when we're imagining that he eventually retires through choice, he never leaves the life, because it seems weird that he would. Like, it's so affected him as a child. It's so not broke him, but damaged him. But anyway, so he involves Batman in the curriculum now, and last time I stopped in the class, they had just watched Chris Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. And so one thing I immediately asked is, has anyone here actually read a comic or seen cartoons of Batman? And a lot of them hadn't. A lot of them, Chris Nolan is their introduction to Batman, and for those who don't play video games, that's the only Batman they know. So, I mean, they're just of that generation right now that they missed out on cartoons that many of us grew up with, and aren't quite old enough to start seeking out other cartoons out of nostalgia or because they're binge watching Netflix. They're teenagers; they've got stuff to do, frankly. You know?
Right.
They're figuring out how to go on dates and juggling social life with studies and all that jazz. So one thing I'll bring up to them is we'll talk about Batman's origin, and I'll talk to them about that in the comics traditionally, Bruce Wayne rather, and his family leaves a movie theater that has shown the mark of Zorro.
Yeah.
And in Chris Nolan's universe, he leaves the Opera House, and they've seen Die Fledermaus.
Right.
And so one thing I ask is, why do you think Nolan did that? Because it's not that he's unaware of the theater.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do we gain or lose from that? And I wait until after we get a few answers before I bring up, well, Nolan did that because he wanted in his universe Batman to be truly unique. That perhaps Batman had created the idea of a masked hero in this version of Earth. There was no Zorro, no Dr. Sin, no Scarlet Pimpernel.
Right.
and nothing that even in fiction could inspire him directly. And we talk about, you know, do you like that? Do you not? What works for you? I also bring up that when we talk about the origin, we talk about what drove him in the movies. I'll bring up sometimes how certain characters are different in the comics. So I'll bring up Ra's al Ghul or Ra's al Ghul and a little bit of how he's different in the comics. I'll bring up how Bane is very different in the comics. That in the comics you get a stronger sense he is the anti-Batman. That you know, Bruce Wayne is born to privilege. At age 8, witnesses his parents' death and decides in the sanctity of life. And Bane is born in a prison, lives by prison rules as the rules of the universe, and at age 8 kills his first man out of necessity and simple survival. And how this sets up this wonderful anti-Batman character. And I bring up to them, you know, now that you know that, do you feel cheated from the movies? Like, do you? And if you don't, that's fine. Like, that's totally, like, let's talk about this. Like, would it have made sense to do a fourth movie to explore this? Or should Bane just not have been in the story? Or did the reinterpretation still work because in the end there's only so much he can do? You know, blah blah blah. And it's just to get them to ask questions and to realize that stories really don't exist in a vacuum. And it's very easy to show with an adaptation, whether it's Batman or Superman or Harry Potter, you can very easily show the differences. And what's more interesting about, at least for me, you can get into further discussion with Batman than with Harry Potter because we all kind of understand that there's one official Harry Potter.
Right.
J.K. Rowling wrote these books, and that's freaking it. No one else can come in and say, well, some say that Harry. No. These are the books. Very similarly to Sherlock Holmes, if you want to talk about the canon, this is the canon. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle also left a lot of leeway for interpretation and questions, which is lovely.
Sure.
But with Batman and Superman, you can very quickly first ask, well, which version are we talking about? And I also bring up, you know, the beauty of these characters that sometimes we'll add something that we do realize this doesn't work, and we'll go back. And one thing I bring up there is that in the 50s, we first met Joe Chill, and we finally had a face and a name of the person who killed Batman's parents. But then we had just a few years later this other story that revealed Joe Chill wasn't just a nameless mugger. He was basically a hitman hired by Lou Moxon. And you suddenly have this whole backstory of, well, Thomas Wayne ticked off Lou Moxon and put him in jail, and so Lou Moxon hired this dude, and da-da-da-da-da. And this is the real reason why his parents were killed, and da-da-da. And years later, they got rid of that. And they went back to, no, it's a mugger. And maybe it wasn't even Joe Chill. Maybe we never caught the guy. Maybe Batman was wrong, and he never actually found the murderer. And I bring up, what do we gain from that? And they're usually pretty on the ball, even the classrooms I've been in where they really have no knowledge of Batman because they're still, they're bright young minds. They're learning how to analyze, and a lot of them will say flat out, like, well, if it's a mob hit, that's not as relatable. And I point out, like, yeah, that's the beauty of, in Batman's case, that's the beauty of his origin, because muggings happened 100 years ago, and they're going to happen 100 years from now. We can always imagine a scenario where someone lost their parents because someone came out of the shadows with a gun.
Yeah, and you know your breadth and depth of knowledge is very large, and I'm curious. You talk about bright young minds. When were you, as a bright young mind, when did you know or sort of decide to be a writer slash historian of all things pop culture?
I mean, there wasn't some ultimate decision, really. It was, I sort of started falling into a certain place, realized people liked it, and then started pushing myself of, well, if we're going to do this, we've got to do it well. So I know a lot. Now it's time to know more. Now it's time to question my beliefs and fact-check myself and see if there's anything apocryphal that I believe in just because of word of mouth. I mean, really, I was writing, as many comic book fans do. I was writing for different fan blogs, and this is in the early ages of the internet, when we still knew that AOL stood for America Online,
right?
And YouTube was not yet a gleam in someone's eye, and I was writing for primarily a site called Monitor Duty. Actually, it was called Fanzing first, and then it evolved into Monitor Duty. But because I quickly gained a reputation, for instance, on the Comic Book Resources message boards for, wait, there are 2 red tornadoes? Look, Alan can explain it. So I gained a bit of a reputation there, and also because of just through social interaction with my own friends in high school and college, who were not, most of them, really into comics. So if I wanted to talk about something that interested me, or if they were asking me, so what's this story about, I had to learn, rather than scare them with info dumps and with bringing up all this tangential information about continuity and stuff, how to break things down into the basics of what is the actual story, what's the basic idea. And that they can appreciate even if they're not going to read it later. And if they want to know further information, like, well, tell me about Earth 2, then we'll go into that. But here's the basic gist. And so I got used to that, and when Monitor Duty and Fanzing were asking for, they had these ideas of every month or every few weeks, let's do a profile on some character. And for newbies who don't know, we'll write this down. Because this is before Wikipedia became a thing, really. Sure. And so I would do these history pieces on, and I could keep it straight. So I was like, this is what is currently in continuity applicable to Power Girl. This is what is currently in continuity since '87, the origin of Two-Face, and blah, blah, blah. And I did that for a few years off and on. Like, it wasn't a job. I was just, it was something I did in between school and work and stuff. And then things like Wikipedia were showing up, and there were so many fan sites, and people were making their own wikis, and I just thought, okay, well, this is actually kind of boring, just to talk about what currently is the in-continuity thing.
Right.
So I brought up, I was supposed to do Infinite Crisis was about to come out, and Power Girl, they were talking about her origin was going to be revised or revealed and all this jazz. And so I said, look, instead of saying what's been canon for Power Girl, let's talk about, behind the scenes of Power Girl. Why was she made up? Why did they change this stuff? How did she become known as someone who's very top-heavy? What were all the ins and outs of this? And how about the storylines that just happened and were weird and then never got mentioned again? Like that time she had a kid. So I started doing that thing, and that really got some hits, and that got some interest. And so they said, hey, keep doing that stuff. And I'm like, okay, so let's talk about the mini origins of Aquaman. and what's worked and what hasn't, and what was freaking weird.
Right.
And so I started doing this stuff, and I would advertise myself a little bit. I would go to message boards where people were discussing similar things.
Mm-hmm.
And if they were, say, talking about the JSA, I would just bring up, like, hey, for anyone who's interested, I just did a profile on Power Girl. Take a look. Let me know what you think. Did I miss anything? Is there something you wish I'd spoken more on? Is there some other character you want me to go for it? And I would go to a few basic message boards and do this. And apparently I started getting the attention of a couple of science fiction writers, Michael Burstein, Keith R.A. DeCandido, Robert Greenberger, who was an editor at Marvel and DC, and his mind is a font of knowledge. Very flatteringly, when I started getting into more science fiction circles, people were calling me the next Robert Greenberger. So he's very much in the same department as me when it comes to all this info storage. But yeah, so these guys started noticing me, and then so I started helping a couple of them out with certain research here and there, because I was faster than Wikipedia at times, and I could put some context here and there that they might have needed. And finally, Warner Brothers called me up one day, or emailed me. No one calls anyone anymore. Yeah. And they emailed me and they said, "Hey, we're putting the Aquaman cartoons on DVD. We're going to do a special behind-the-scenes featurette of the history of Aquaman. We've been using your online profile on the history of Aquaman as a guide because we found it to be the most expansive, but also the easiest to read. So we're going to be filming in New York. We understand in your profile you said you're located in New York. Would you be interested in showing up on here?" And they told me flat out, part of the appeal of me was, I think I was 25 at the time, maybe 26. You want to have a couple faces that sort of break up the documentary or the featurette.
Sure.
And the fact was, they were talking to a lot of comic writers and some TV writers and all. So it was kind of, they liked the idea of bringing me in, who was a dude under 30, or really under, I think the youngest other person on there was at least 35, 36, yeah. So that I was of a different generation and would speak with a different energy, and was not coming at it from a place of that I worked on anything or worked for the company, that I was coming at it from the place of a fan who both loved Aquaman but could also laugh at him.
Sure.
And so they liked me a lot, and they decided that they were going to keep calling me up here and there for different documentary featurettes, and they had asked what label to put. They were going to put comic book expert, and I said no, that sounds egotistical, and also it's a little too general.
Right. Right.
And a few people who had been linking to articles of mine over that year leading up to that were referring to me as a comic book historian. So I said, that's really my gig, history, and the evolution of it. Can we use that? And they're like, no, that sounds great. So they put up comic book historian. They basically put me on file as that. And I said, well, if I'm showing up on DVDs, I need to print out business cards and start charging more.
That's right.
And so that just kept pushing the ball, and I just kept pushing things forward each year, where it's like, all right, I've done this, what can I do next? What can I talk about next? And not ever get into that hole of this is the one thing I talk about or this is the one subject I do. Just keep pushing it and spread yourself out, work for different sites here and there, get known by different crowds and appreciated for different things. So these folks will talk to you about Doctor Who, these folks will talk to you about comics and superheroes. These folks will talk to you about Star Trek and the different ways that it approached time travel. And which also helped that I was getting to know certain science fiction writers, that some of the small fan conventions such as Shore Leave or Icon and Lunacon and Farpoint, it's basically my buddies were in a lot of panels, like Greg Cox and Dave Mack and others, and And they would say, hey, you want to be on our panel? Because you had that really great insight about how they approach time travel in that story. And I would say, sure. And once you start appearing on the smaller fan panels, someone there tends to go to larger conventions. They maybe want you on their panel. Mm-hmm. And you just keep pushing it. You just keep networking. And it has been a fun and sort of wild ride where I joke that basically I just took an idea from Sherlock Holmes that all the day jobs I was doing weren't working for me, so I made up my own. Which is not entirely true, because there are other people who do what I do, just in different ways.
Well, sure, but you as I was doing research for this interview, and I was going back and I was reading through your articles, as you've written, of course, for the MarySue.com and Wired.com and all of those. I think the historian label is very interesting, because your approach to criticism is that you use lenses, you use critical lenses such as feminist lenses to approach things, and also sort of an anthropological, as just by how you're talking this evening, and sort of we're just discussing these topics cursory, you have a very anthropological approach to things. Where did this come from? Whose writing influenced you to sort of realize that you can apply what people would think were more critical analysis lenses to things like comic books or Doctor Who or things of this nature?
I think part of it was like I said, just conversations with my grandfather about what year did this come out and what was happening, and also just that I had the fortune of having some really good English and literature teachers and journalism teachers in high school and college. In college, Elizabeth Stone, who's published a few books. I took English with her in college, and I remember people talking about, oh, she's so tough. Yo, you're going to hate her. She's so tough. And I rather enjoyed the class. And I told her at the end, like, hey, Warden, which is what I called her, why do I hear you're such a hard ass? Because I had a good time. And she's like, yeah, but you know what you're doing. I was like, oh, all right, cool. So that was a great ego boost. And then she invited me to her journalism class and then her private journalism/autobiography class. And all of that I basically took and applied to writing about entertainment. And as well as, like I said, just growing up with a grandfather who said, ask yourself why. And then also when I was a kid, I didn't just read the comics because my grandfather had put me on a certain path of thinking about it. I would buy those big books about Marvel, 50 years of Marvel, and the history of DC that usually were written by Les Daniels, and he, although he was focusing on a company, so to speak, like he would bring up some basic poetic imagery, other than just giving you the facts. He would talk about, here are the Fantastic Four, and they're sort of a nuclear family with the Thing and the Human Torch as the kids, or he brought up, you could almost, though it's not intentional, look at the Fantastic Four as the four elements of earth, air, fire, and water, and just that he would bring up that kind of imagery, that kind of symbolism, and likewise Mr. Cheeseman in high school would bring up how you could find a meaning in stories even if they weren't intended. If you were feeling it, then it's there. And you're free to examine that and what brought that to your mind. So yeah, all of that played into a factor. And then as I was still very early into it when I met Robert Greenberger, and he and I, our conversations about what works about Batman, what works about Iron Man, where did they go wrong with the Avengers at times, or whatever. Like, just our conversations were great on that end, partly because we didn't have to ever explain any references to each other. We both knew. It's like, well, I mean, when you bring up the Gil Kane stuff, we were both, oh, of course, the Gil Kane stuff. Yeah. We both automatically knew right off the bat what each other's talking about.
Sure.
If very rarely did we not, and often if we didn't, it was because of it was a generational thing, or the fact that he actually worked behind the scenes on several of these projects, and I only knew what was on the printed page.
Sure.
But yeah, so all that came into play, and also the fans and the readers, frankly, because when I was doing some of those early pieces, if I glossed over something or just said, well, that's not great, so we're not going to talk about it, some people would call me out on it. Some of them were jerks, but some of them brought up really good points of, I was really hoping to hear your analysis on this because I thought of this, and I would be like, yeah, you're right, I should have talked about that. Okay.
I want to segue because I want to make sure that we get into talking about your wonderful book, Doctor Who: A History, which I just got done with this past week. Now, Doctor Who: A History, it's about a 50-year-old phenomenon. What is it that you found in researching and writing this book, and also as a fan yourself of the Doctor, that what is it about Doctor Who that appeals to so many?
I think it's the simple thing that it's set up to tell any story. Practically, you're given a character who has no real history, so there's a lot you can imply and infer, which is always fun. It's a very typical British quality for heroes as well. Bernard Quatermass and Sherlock Holmes and Dumbledore to a large degree, and Merlin, they're big question marks. Gandalf, they're all big question marks who almost appear in a vacuum. And even if you're given information about them from before you met them, you can't quite imagine them as kids. You can't quite imagine 10-year-old Sherlock Holmes not going to bed when he's told to. It's a very British quality to make the hero sort of mysterious and make them more about what they do than who they were growing up, whereas Americans are obsessed with origin stories. But anyway, yeah, you've got this mysterious hero, which also appeals to Americans as sort of a Western, going from place to place, finding what's wrong, doing good for its own sake. I think the fact that there's not a direct quest also leaves it so open, because he's not on a path specifically for justice. He's not tracking down, except for the Seventh Doctor sometimes, he's not tracking down reports of evil and deciding, I will stamp this out. He's not a Green Lantern with a mandate from someone else. He's just hanging out. He's just going on a path that's not in a straight line, and coming across these things. And once he finds them, although he might not have been looking for trouble, he will stop it. He will not let good people suffer if he can stop it. That general quest, I think, keeps a lot of characters timeless. The fact that you have Superman and Batman are both there to do good. Zorro was specifically fighting corruption in Los Angeles at a certain time period, and so we tend to keep him as a period character. Scarlet Pimpernel also, it's very much a period character, because it's not just I'm fighting evil, it's I'm fighting the fact that the French Revolution went too far. So you've got that, and the fact that you've got a ship that can go anywhere
and do anything.
And yeah, so you don't have to be set into a certain genre, and the audio plays approach that more beautifully than in any other medium, I think, because you'll have audio plays where it's not even directly a story. There's one audio play, Live 34, where each episode is a news broadcast over the radio, and so you're hearing radio, and you're hearing about all these things happening, and through what the reporters will say and not say, you very clearly get an idea of a censorship from the government and a totalitarian regime. And then when you get reports about this strange radicals, Ace and the Doctor, and when you hear interviews about them, you piece together the story. But it's all basically told as if it's the radio equivalent of found footage.
Mm-hmm.
And it works beautifully, and you can do that with Doctor Who, because there can be a situation where he lands in a place that has no idea who he is, and will talk about him in the way that these reporters talk about him.
Yes.
Superman, it's unusual for him to go to a planet where no one knows where he is. It can happen. It's just unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Batman, he's got to head to Europe or parts of South America to really be unknown.
Mm-hmm.
That same thing. You've got the versatility of it, the fact that they built into the character that you can have different versions of that character. So the novelist and the audio drama people, if they come up with a story and it's like, well, this would be a great story for the 4th Doctor, but we're on the 12th now. Well, it doesn't matter. Call up Tom Baker and record a new audio drama. Now the 4th Doctor's with us. Or just write the damn book, and here's the 4th Doctor again, because it worked for him. And so yeah, versatility and that it's a story that also embraces the impossible in its own absurdity, which always gives you so much more leeway.
Because for me, I vaguely remember first seeing it on PBS when I was a young child, and then I totally forgot about it until it began airing again once it restarted in the early part of the last decade on a Sci-Fi Channel here in America. And I remember sitting there, and I think it aired on Friday nights, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm sitting there, and it was a David Tennant episode, and I was sitting there, I'm watching it, and I'm starting to go, oh, this seems familiar yet unfamiliar, and it was the episode where he meets Sarah Jane again in K9, and it's the school.
Oh yeah, school reunion.
The school reunion one, and I remember getting done with that episode and turning to my girlfriend at the time and going, what is this? Like, this seems, and I started going, this seems really, really familiar. Like, I can't put my finger on it, though. And that sort of started me down the rabbit hole with it, and going back and watching it currently, and I've caught up and I've watched every episode that's available through Netflix and DVD of all 50 years. What's the first adventure for you that hooked you on this character and on this series?
Yeah, I saw bits of it on PBS, and I would always seem to come in halfway through, so I never understood what the hell was happening. And I'd watch for 10 minutes, figure, well, I'm not catching up, and change the channel. And a few times I would hear them call this guy with the vegetable doctor, and then a few times I would hear them call this guy with the scarf doctor. So I was like, is it like Green Lantern where you pass the ring on, or what happens? And I didn't know. And then there was one night I was at a friend's house, and we were just going through TV, and I was a Nighthawk, so I was never asleep on time. And Battlefield began, and it was a 7th Doctor adventure. And I thought, okay, now this one is just starting the beginning. Perhaps now, if we watch it from the beginning, we will understand something more about this whole thing. And Battlefield actually turned out to be the perfect intro for me, because you had the unit showed up, and there was a new Brigadier Bambera, who had not met the Doctor before, and so one of the unit soldiers had to tell her, look, this guy, he didn't steal a unit badge. He works with us. Sometimes, it seems like a different man, all called Doctor. It's like, so they're different people. Like, no. That's what we thought. But no, it's the same person.
Yeah.
Somehow he changes his complete appearance, and sometimes even a little bit how he behaves. But it's the same person, and he's an expert on aliens. We don't know where he's from. So then I was realizing, so all those guys are the same guys. Okay, that's interesting. He's a shapeshifter somehow. Interesting. And then in that same adventure, you had the Brigadier show up, who I just immediately adored as sort of a John Wayne, Captain Kirk type character. And I love old soldiers who come back out of retirement because things got to get done. And Battlefield's a great adventure for that, where he's literally gardening. He's so retired. His wife Doris comes up, says the Prime Minister's on the phone, he sort of complains like, "Look, I'm fading away. Don't leave me alone." Mm-hmm. And she says, "But it's the doctor." And you just see him freeze and just have this understanding like, "Okay, this is it again."
Yeah.
And I love that. I love that those stories of that sort of loyalty and camaraderie, like coming out of retirement for your pals. So I was loving that. And then that same story brought up Merlin, mm-hmm. and had a knight from Arthur's time see the doctor and recognize him as Merlin and say that you weren't wearing this face, but you are he who lives backwards and forwards through time and whose magic deceives the senses and all that jazz. So all of these elements are coming together, and I just thought, well, this is dynamite. Like, now I've got to watch more. And at that time, you could still readily find tie-in books or novelizations, because before reruns and videotapes, novelizations, they novelized all the TV stories, and that was how kids in, say, the 70s would be aware of what had happened for the previous doctors, mm-hmm. And in the early 80s, before you started really doing reruns and all. Mm-hmm. So you would find some of those. So I quickly caught up on a lot of the mythos, and then Napster came along, and I met some people who were getting into the audio dramas and trading them. As soon as I found out there was a place you could buy the audio dramas, I was like, oh, well, I'm grabbing those. So yeah, and then also there were people who were trading. They had their VHS copies of whatever episodes they taped off of television, and then they were digitizing them and putting them on Napster. So then I was watching through all the episodes I'd missed. Mm-hmm. And in a couple of years, I'd gone through, not a couple of years, maybe 3 years or something, gone through the whole series, basically, along with the radio recreations of the lost episodes. Mm-hmm. And I just found it fascinating because, again, you almost have to work to make, it's not hard to make a lame Doctor Who story. Mm-hmm. It does seem hard to make one that doesn't at all work with Doctor Who. You almost have to make effort in that. You almost have to just ignore the basic tenets of what he will and won't do. Mm-hmm. And I find and his behavior, his moral code is malleable because he won't kill a person, but if you put him in a position, he might trick that person into killing themselves, or he might trick that person into blowing up their whole planet. Mm-hmm. All you have to do is give that moment of he's giving them a choice, mm-hmm. and the rest becomes justifiable. So it's you've really got to work hard to screw it up. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I found it so interesting that like with James Bond, we all have our idea of what is James Bond, and we're going to compare them. Mm-hmm. And the fact that Doctor Who, you're deliberately not supposed to compare them past a certain level because the second Doctor isn't supposed to seem like the first Doctor, and he's not supposed to be the third Doctor. Mm-hmm. That gives you such a beautiful freedom, mm-hmm. automatically. So well, Alan Scott isn't Kyle Rayner. They're not supposed to be.
Right. Well, I thought it was interesting too as I was reading the book, and then I was thinking about especially how I got fascinated with the history of the comics of Doctor Who.
Right.
A few years ago when they released the Dave Gibbons Fourth Doctor collection, IDW did.
Oh yeah.
Which is really beautiful. And I started going back and picking up things, and then I started realizing, it's like, good Lord, Dave Gibbons and Grant Morrison and Dan Abnett and Mark Buckingham and Andy Diggle and Dave Taylor. Yeah. All of these people. In the thing that was the most amazing to me about the comics, and that really is because Titan is now handling the comic property, is that they seem to genuinely care about writing a good story, what you're talking about. This isn't, some people could very easily just do work for hire garbage. That doesn't seem to be the case with the comics, at least the ones that I've read.
And there's an irony there because in the 80s, due to the way the BBC was being run and due to the fact that John Nathan Turner didn't want people on Doctor Who who had written it before, he thought he needed to give it as much a fresh twist as possible. Mm-hmm. you had a lot of writers and directors who just came in for one or two stories and they went back to the detective show they were working on, or
Right.
a soap opera, and maybe they had a mild interest in Doctor Who, or maybe they were just doing something different, or maybe the BBC just said, look, we need you to do, fill in an episode here, and here's what the premise is going to be, so just script it out for us, won't you? So you did have on the television show some writers who were kind of just phoning it in, or had a story that could have worked for other characters, and they just changed three things so that suddenly the Doctor's there and there's a time travel scene at the beginning and the end.
Mm-hmm.
But the comics, I mean, this was done, but by the 80s, especially when it transferred to what became Doctor Who magazine, no one on that magazine wasn't a fan.
Right.
That's the whole point of the magazine was fandom.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when you get people who really they really want to tell this story about Doctor Who,
mm-hmm.
and that love translates. And you've got it's a shame to me, honestly, that they haven't dipped more into the people who write the tie-ins.
Yeah.
To write the television episodes. Russell T Davies did that
mm-hmm.
several times. Moffat hasn't done that as much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a shame because, I talked to Paul Cornell. He's got more episodes he'd like to do. Grant and I have had a few discussions about what he would like to do and exploring the TARDIS a little bit more.
Oh, that'd be fantastic, yeah.
He came up with that wonderful idea in the comics that later got used in a couple of audio plays, that the TARDIS has memory rooms. Mm-hmm. That there are these rooms almost like holodecks that sort of record locations it's landed in.
Oh, okay.
So you can open a door and there's a mountain range.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff like that. Grant had lots of... Actually, one of the first conversations we got into this discussion about if Jason Statham were cast as the Doctor. And I was laughing, so it would basically be, because the third Doctor was martial arts, it would basically be like him for a new generation, and Grant was like, yeah, it would be like this drugged-up doctor on Kung Fu. It's like, yeah! And then we just started, joking about what enemies he would have to face then if you have to, upgrade the Cybermen to have... There has to be a martial arts model, stuff like that. But, yeah, they have such great imagination.
How did you feel about the Prisoners of Time series that was sort of not only a love letter to all of the incarnations, but it was also kind of a love letter goodbye note for IDW as they were on their way out from handling the property and had done it so very well. At least I thought that they had handled it well with the creative teams they had brought in. What were your thoughts on Prisoners of Time?
I liked it. I thought it was very cute. Yeah, it's like I said, it's just sort of a love letter, and so it's one of those things. If I were judging it differently, if it were just some big story they did, I think I might be more critical about certain aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Not in an angry way. Just there are a couple things I think I might have looked at more. But the love letter aspect of it, and the fact that they were saying goodbye. You forgive certain things like that, like you forgive for an anniversary celebration,
mm-hmm.
because it's really not about crossing every T. It's about, hey, didn't we have a good time here? Mm-hmm. And I think they handled it very nicely, and they'd had a lot of fun exploring some different aspects of it. I was ups and downs with different IDW Doctor Who stories, but
mm-hmm.
I think there's no doubting that you had people who, again, cared about it and were writing this because they really wanted to write that Doctor Who story that was in them.
And in that sense of, you just mentioned that the sense of fun, wasn't this fun? I got that feeling as I was reading your Doctor Who: A History book. Was there anything that was just sort of unbelievably surprising while you were doing research for the book that came out of left field almost?
In a way, I feel like I've been doing research on it for years because I'd written so much leading up to then about Doctor Who and done so many interviews
mm-hmm.
for it. I think some of the surprising stuff was more talking to some of the older people involved.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and they would keep up with some aspects of the show, but weren't aware of others. So it was sort of surprising to me when I wound up telling them about something they weren't quite aware of. Like Philip Hinchcliffe, who was he's such a huge spearhead in Doctor Who. He was Tom Baker's first producer, and those first 2 seasons under Hinchcliffe and script editor writer Robert Holmes, oh man, they established so much of Doctor Who, and you've got that Hammer horror film influence, and it's absolutely wonderful. And he and had really driven Sarah Jane into this wonderful new direction of being truly a companion and not just an assistant. And he had created Leela. And during our conversation, I realized he didn't know how Leela left the show.
Huh.
Because, he'd left, and he knew that she left the TARDIS eventually, and if someone had, he just didn't know what the story circumstances were. So I told him how, myself included, some people thought it was a rather not a great or proper ending for her, and that Louise Jameson had felt it at the time. And I told him, and he immediately was like, "No, that doesn't work." And we started discussing what would have been an ending for Leela, and so that was marvelous. And I think also what was surprising to me is how much there are so many franchises where the actors, they respect the character and they respect the story and they love what it means to people, but they're also not terribly following the continuity of the stories themselves. Or really paying attention to some of the fanish details that we pay attention to. So it was surprising to me when you find how many of the Doctor Who people actually do. Like they absolutely know this. Lisa Bowerman, who plays Bernice Summerfield in the audio plays and directs many of the audio plays, like she can tell you, like, oh yeah, that adventure came out in 1967, and that guy directed it. And Sylvester McCoy will tell you flat out, his opinions about the different Seventh Doctor adventures and what happened here and there, and what inspired this scene. And Nicholas Courtney was like that. I did not have the pleasure of ever meeting Nicholas Courtney. He passed away before I got to interview him. But if you listen to any DVD commentary with him, he will tell you, oh yes, well, see, Robert Holmes did this in the 70s, and this was, and then 3 years later we established that Gallifrey had, he was like that.
Yeah. Well, we're almost out of time. I want to get out on this question here. What advice would you have for people or young people, really anyone of any age, who would like to begin writing about pop culture issues, or just pop culture in general? Sort of, what advice would you give them?
Really look at different points of views. Keep in mind the differences between views that you don't agree with and views that you actually think are wrong. There's a difference there.
Okay.
Like misogyny is wrong, but you can have different points of view on how Wonder Woman is done.
Right.
And you can also keep in mind whatever the hell you're writing about. It is possible to still enjoy something while recognizing their problematic elements. Again, on Wonder Woman, I think Azzarello does a really good job with her personality, and I think he writes an excellent storyline with her. I still really dislike the changes they made to her origin and don't think it's added anything to the saga. I think it's actually taken away things from the character. So yeah, recognize for yourself not just the problems other people are putting up, but what's problematic and things you enjoy, what you make allowances for. And like we've been saying since the beginning, look at the context of anything, including people who are saying something you really dislike. Just look at the context, and if it changes your mind, well, that'll be interesting. And if it doesn't, well, now you've cemented your point of view, and isn't that better? Because you can now prepare for those counter-arguments. And just write, and find friends who are willing to tell you this doesn't work, or this is too long, or you lost the thread here.
Yeah. Someone to give you constructive criticism.
Not just constructive criticism, but criticism from different points of views. Anytime I'm writing a piece on feminism, I have women look at it, shockingly. Yeah. Because guess what? I can't actually write from their point of view. It's not one I've lived.
Right.
I can empathize, but it ain't my life. So, yeah.
Well, Alan, thank you so much. Can you hang out one sec while I wrap things up?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you for everyone for tuning in this week. Feel free to share the show via Google+, Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, whatever your poison may be. If you want to contact me to ask me questions about the show or just to chat in general, you can catch me over on Twitter at JLDPROD2002. If you want to talk some more with Alan over on Twitter, you can catch him at Sizzler Kistler. Is that correct, sir?
Yeah.
Okay. Our Twitter question this week is, what is your favorite Doctor Who moment? Please feel free to answer and share that. And as always, give it the hashtag after Wednesday so that everyone can join in on the conversation. Again, thanks to my guest Alan Kistler tonight. Go pick up his book. It's really good. Doctor Who, A History. Also, you've seen his website this evening. You can link to all of his wonderful articles from there. I thank him. I thank you. Until next time, everybody.